Before going to the formal business, can I just welcome everyone to the first of our autumn meetings. Memorial Lewis is our new Acting General Secretary. She was here for one lecture at the end of last term. Welcome to Memorial. We have minutes.
And a very warm welcome to all of you in the room, our fellows and affiliates. The Society of Antiquaries of London Ordinary Meeting, Thursday, the 18th of May, 2023, Summer Miscellany. Professor Martin Millett, President in the chair, and the President introduced Ms. Memorial Lewis, Interim General Secretary to the meeting. Following the recent death of Professor Dame Rosemary Cramp, FSA, the meeting showed their respect by minute silence. The minutes of the anniversary meeting of Thursday, the 27th of April, 2023, were read and signed. The following miscellany papers were then laid before the Society: The Estrange of Hunstanton, Norfolk, and the Life of the English Republic by Anna Key, OBE, Alice the Adamite and Penelope Punk, An Unusual Riotous History of the English Revolution by Dr. Jonathan Healy, James II's Coronation Cup, The Coronation Procession, and the Barons of the St. Paul by Teresa Murdoch, FSA, with comments from Dr. Dora Thornton, FSA. Thanks were returned for these communications. The President announced that the next meeting would be Thursday, the 5th of October, 2023, then adjourned the meeting. A summer reception followed.
Is it your pleasure that I sign these minutes as a true and complete record? We now come to the main business of today's meeting, which is to hear our paper. This paper, Forging Iron from the Sky, by Ian Thackeray. Welcome, Ian. Ian gave up his office job for a career in blacksmithing in 2008 and has been involved in many weird and wonderful projects, earning him a place on the council for the National Heritage Ironworks Group, as well as the Diploma of Merit from the Worshipful Company of Blacksmiths. And he's going to talk to us this evening about that practical experience of blacksmithing and how it helps us understand the artifacts that we as antiquarians spend so much time studying. A very warm welcome to you, Ian.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. First and foremost, before we get much further, behave yourself, behave yourselves, behave yourselves. That's the blacksmiths in the room dealt with. Any good project needs help. I've always said this from day one. My dad taught it to me as well. And so before I begin the presentation, I would like to acknowledge the help of Will Sherman as the project partner. Luke Winter, unfortunately can't be here, but he was project mentor, research helper. He's one of those people that if you mention, just niggle an idea in his head, you get a text message about 3 o'clock in the morning going, got it, it's fine, don't worry about it. The Chalk Valley History Festival, they gave us a platform from which to be able to present the research that we took to the public. And they were very, very grateful in being able to give us a small budget as well towards paying for the costs. James Spedding, blacksmith, he was the person who got me hooked on. Yeah, so that happened at a blacksmithing event about approximately 10 years ago, when he first told me about these meteoric artifacts, and it's just been sat in my head ever since then. And finally, the National Heritage Ironworks Group, who again were they were great supporters of what we were doing. They allowed me to do the talk in public in the first place. The hieroglyphs at the bottom there, they translate as beer and pet. That is a literal translation of iron from the sky. And that is what we are talking about tonight. In 3300 BC, a 14-year-old was buried in a Gerson cemetery. In their grave were clay pots, a limestone mace, a copper harpoon, and around their neck and their waist were 2 strings of beads. In 1912, Gerald Wainwright oversaw the excavation of grave 67, and when he saw the corroded objects, he knew that they were iron. What he didn't know was the origin, and so he set forth 3 possibilities as to where they came from. The first was native iron, so iron nodes plucked from the ground and ready to work. This was discounted as the only source of native iron at the time was in Greenland, and to the best of our knowledge, pre-dynastic Egypt hadn't got trade routes with Greenland. The next option was smelting the iron, so creating it from iron ore, but that was discounted because there was no evidence of smelting in that time period by anyone in the world. And even to this day, we've still not found the evidence. And so that left the option of meteorites. The idea of it being meteoric was then proven and disproven over the following 100 years or so, until 2013, when Professor Thilo Roeren, Dr. Diane Johnson, both independently worked on the beads. I have to excuse me. This is sciencey stuff, and that's why I started hitting hot metal for a living, so I could avoid it. Thilo Roeren used prompt gamma activation analysis, particle-induced X-ray emissions to be able to reach into and analyze the heart of each of the beads, or the beads he was looking at. And this meant that they were furthest away from the source of corrosion on the outside of the bead. And so he was able to see much more accurately what the original composition of these metals, of this iron object was. And Dr. Johnson used electron microscopy and X-ray microcomputer tomology to be able to analyze the surface of the beads. And they found, yes, they found iron. That would explain the corrosion. They also found high enough levels of nickel for it to be meteoric, as well as other elements such as germanium, which are all very common in meteorites. Professor Roeren and Dr. Johnson also both put forward theories as to how these beads were created. And this was great because it meant that Will and I had other options other than our own personal thoughts to be able to investigate. Professor Roeren hypothesized that the beads were created by heating the meteorites, allowing it to anneal, so allowing it to cool very, very slowly, and then that process makes the bead softer, and so would be easier to forge. Her initial findings, Dr. Diane Johnson said that the beads would have been forged cold because she found cracking on the surface of the beads. However, she did a further practical experiment which disproved this theory. And we'll look at that a bit later on. And so the big question for a lot of people when they were talking to me was, why do the experiment? These things, and we've contacted a lot of institutions for help, including the Petrie Museum, and we have representatives from there tonight. We contacted a lot of institutions for help, which they gave very gratefully, but they all came back with the question, why? And for a lot of people, it would be because of, I don't know, scientific improvement of scientific understanding, improvement of understanding from the time period of the culture that we're facing. For me, it was a red rag to a bull. Experimental archaeology has failed to produce forged steel objects with layers of high nickel composition. Whenever the nickel content exceeds approximately 3%, the increased brittleness of the metal causes the nickel-rich fractions to fail and shatter. It was that first phrase, experimental archaeology has failed, that prompted me to give it a go. Not that I'm petty in the slightest. But it's one of these things that it was a definitive statement. There was no, they have tried but not succeeded yet. It was defined as failed. And so to the research. And the first thing we needed to look at was the objects themselves. So these are the 3 beads held in the Petrie Museum. I went to see them for the first time today, and it was wonderful to behold. And what we can see is large cracks going along the surface of the beads. Now, some of these, for instance, that one along there, in the small beads, that is where the 2 ends of a flat sheet have overlapped. And the same as well on the middle bead. But on the large bead, in fact, this is the grain structure of the meteorite coming into effect. And not knowing if people have got experience of looking at meteorites, I've got one with me here. This is a piece of Campo de Cello, which landed in Argentina. And this was our practice piece of meteorite. This is much easier to get hold of than Gebel Kamil, which was an Egyptian meteorite that landed around 5,000 years ago. Campo de Cello is much easier to get hold of. It's a much larger meteorite, and so therefore, from a blacksmith's perspective, much cheaper. I'll pass this around so you can all have a look at it. But if you hold it top and bottom and hold it, shake it next to your ear, it rattles. And that is because of the grain structure of the meteorite itself. And so explaining the grain structure is easiest done probably using jelly babies and toffee. Bear with me on this one. So if you poured out a bag of jelly babies on the table, they're all overlapping, they're sat on top of each other. Some are sitting upwards, others are pointing down, and then it's just a chaotic jumble of oblongs. And if you poured a toffee sauce over the top and allowed it to harden, then it would be a solid object. And so for our meteorite, the jelly babies are little, tiny little iron nodes. And our toffee sauce is the nickel that is effectively acting as a glue, holding it together. And so when you start to forge the meteorite flat, if you do it cold, as Johnson first tried, then well, there's no easy way to say it. You end up with very expensive shrapnel on your workshop floor, because all that happens is that nickel breaks apart, it can't hold it together, and it goes everywhere. And so this is what we were facing. It was not going to cooperate cold, and so we needed to be able to heat the metal up. This is one of the X-rays taken by the Thilo Roren, and it shows something quite surprising to us, especially when we were told by one of the institutions we contacted that they were definitely done cold because one of the papers had said so. So we've got the small bead, medium bead, and the large bead. In the large bead, you can see there's large fissures going from the surface into the heart all over the place. And that is where these layers of squashed iron that have overlapped have started to peel apart. But because they don't go all the way through and they just stop, it means that they're only peeling away from the layer underneath. They're not snapping the meteorite apart. And again, in my little box of tricks, I've got one of the early meteorites we made, which I've rather affectionately referred to as the croissant, as you will see. There is no way this should have held together when creating it, and yet somehow it has. So again, I'll pass this round so you can see. And when you look at it, you'll see that there are cracks, there are splits all over the bead itself, but it is still in one piece, it is still solid. We did have another one of those that we were handing around at Chalk Valley, but unfortunately, an incredibly enthusiastic 8-year-old went, oh, I bet I can break it, and did. What we can see though with the very obvious thing that we take from this X-ray though is the thickness of the beads. And the small bead up there is approximately the wall thickness is just under 1 millimeter thick. The wall thickness of the medium bead is about 1.5 to 2 millimeters, and the wall thickness of the largest bead there was about approximately 4 millimeters thick. But as you go through, as I point out, you've got the large cracks and fissures in the largest bead. You've got a couple in the medium bead, but in the small bead, there is almost nothing. And that little, it's almost a hair flick at the top. Again, that is the end of one of the halves of meteorite where they've rolled it into a cylinder. And so the more you compressed it, by the looks of things, the more you compressed it, the stronger it became. The next part of research was tools and equipment. The metalworking scene here, Will found this image, and it came with translations of what they were saying. And so you can tell that they knew what to do. It wasn't, their metalworking technology at the time wasn't slightly random and, hit and hope and pray for the best and, sort of the laws of probability or anything like that. They knew how to work metal. By this stage, I believe 3,300 BC, bronze work had been around for over 700 years. Gold work had been around for even longer. And so they knew what to do. And we were using these scenes to be able to understand the tools and the equipment. Unfortunately, nothing that we know of comes from 3,300 BC. And in fact, the earliest mention we found of metalworkers came from the tombs in Saqqara, where up at the top, we've got a row of 6 people with blowpipes of some description, the large wad on the end blowing into a furnace. And so we knew that at the time period, they weren't looking at bellows or sort of weird and wonderful contraptions. It was a very simple way of doing things. The previous scene, again, from around the same time period, gentleman there raising his hand and the person opposite him having something held in his hand. I mean, anyone who's visited the Petrie Museum or the British Museum will know that Egyptians could carve scenes. It wasn't a mistake or a rough interpretation. There was definitely items held in their hands. And even the person pouring whatever's going on there was holding what we think might have been either 2 rocks or 2 pieces of clay as insulators, so to not transfer the heat. And so we've got a few things working there. We've got rocks, we've got blowpipes into a fire. A bit of independent research, we found that the fuel of choice was charcoal, which was a huge relief. Charcoal at that stage had been around for 700 years. Prior to that, it would have been dried animal dung. And if I'm honest, I'm not sure I would have wanted to do it if I was having to smell that every single day. And then a few more scenes from 1850 BC, again, with blowpipes into a furnace. Over here, however, someone's standing on objects that with going into the fire. And so we thought that for large and high temperatures that were needed for a long period of time, so for instance, for melting copper or gold, they would use bellows or bellow type objects. But unlike our ones later on where that was all hand operated, it would have been done by foot. As you can tell from my physique, I did not fancy standing and walking on the spot all day at a festival. And so we went for the blowpipe option. But to find a natural hollow tube was a bit of a struggle. We looked at the plants that Egypt has now. Reeds are triangular in form, and as far as we could work out, aren't hollow. They might have used a wooden tube and bored a hole out. Again, if you look at some of the Egyptian necklaces, they knew how to drill holes through very fine, fragile objects. And so being able to put a hole through a piece of wood wouldn't have been a problem. And then it happened on one day, I was taking my dog for a walk, and there by the path was a broken piece of cow parsley. And that is a hollow fibrous tube that is very strong, stands up well to temperature, And so we gave that a try, and it worked wonderfully. Carrying on, because we didn't want to get the research wrong, we looked throughout the Egyptian history as much as there were as many images as we could find, and they all followed a theme. So blowpipe, rock, and then this object down here has been described as a granite anvil on a wooden block. So the granite, very hard, very resilient material. And in fact, Will was recently on an expedition to France where he discovered a local blacksmith who still uses, bless you, who still uses a granite anvil today. And so granite, that's no problem. I do a lot of work in Scotland. Finding granite up there was very easy. And the wooden block would be firstly to soften and deaden the noise, be able to lift that piece of granite up a little bit further off the ground to make it easy to work. When I was in Scotland, we found a lump of granite that was approximately a foot or so tall, and so we didn't worry, and we knew we'd be working on mud, and so we didn't worry about trying to put a wooden block underneath it. And so on to the method. Here we have examples of the Campopicello meteorite in the background, and then forged into flat sheet and then rolled up. And so the fire. We have, this was before we found out about cow parsley, we have a copper tube, leftover piece of copper pipe when we did the heating in our house, and a charcoal fire, which is the fuel of choice for Will every single day. Just two of us using a copper pipe, we were able to get the temperature of the fire up to 1,000 degrees. I hasten to add at this stage, both of us had COVID, and so our lungs weren't at their best. But even then, we were still able to reach 1,000 degrees, which for a blacksmith is it's a good working temperature. It will get the metal up, so it's easy enough to be able to move. Forging the beads was a very strange experience. It is nothing like anything we've ever come across before. We both do a lot of work with raw time, which has got a laminate structure to it. And so as you're forging it, if it's not hot enough, it just starts to split and delaminates and just starts to break apart. With meteorite, if you weren't forging it hot enough, then it doesn't just start to delaminate, it just falls apart. And so those first few moments when we were hitting the metal and bits were falling off, we were looking at some potentially a very expensive mistake. But we persevered, and what we found was that these small sections that were breaking off, if we carried on working them, would produce very fine flat sheets like the original, like the smallest bead, or similar to the smallest bead that was used. And so we persevered with them, and we found that very quickly we were able to grade the material from the thickest down to the smallest and make beads according to that. This was with modern tools and equipment. So you can see the beads there resting on the modern anvil. We were using modern hammer and modern blacksmithing tongs at that stage. And so we needed to change this. We had to step away from our comfort zone, because if we went into an event like the Chalk Valley History Festival with 19th century blacksmith's anvil, 20th century hammer, and some tongs that we made last week, we wouldn't have been happy with it, and quite honestly would have called it off and possibly refunded some of the money. But we wanted to do it authentically. There was no point even thinking about any other option. And so we went back to those images. We saw the sort of size of stone that they were using, and popped down to the garden centre and bought mixed bags of large stones to be able to try out and use. A lot of people had said try limestone or quartz, sort of specific granites. I wasn't able to bring all of them with me because, as you can imagine, walking around London with a rucksack of pebbles gives you weird looks. But I brought one of the stones with me, and we ended up opting for dolomite from Kimmeridge Bay, which annoyed my girlfriend profusely because she was under the understanding we were going for a nice family day out, not to spend the entire day looking at me bending out the ground going, oh, that's a good one. Yeah, that'll go in the pocket. And it felt like I was 4 years old again. I'm not gonna lie. But this is, as I said, these are just picked off the beach, and very quickly just juggled them around in my hand and found comfortable ways to be able to hold beads. Hold the stones, be able to strike them in a multitude of different ways. So this particular one, you can see there's chip marks on the bottom. Again, I'll pass this one round. Chip marks on the bottom because this was the heaviest of the stones, and so it was effectively our sledgehammer. So taking the large initial pieces of meteorite, heating them up, placing them on the anvil, and then hitting them with the hammer stone. And so, and the final piece, well, two other pieces, the rockets on, that's actually a piece of, I believe it was a piece of York stone, not the granite we had. When this photo was taken, I hadn't found the lump of granite yet. But this stone we used for being able to refine the beads, because when they come out of the forge, they look like the croissant that's just being passed around. So very dull, very boring grey colour. And if you were an ancient Egyptian, you'd been brought this magical material and you forged it out and end up looking like that. Whoever it was who was financing it, or if it was yourself, would be rather dejected. What we do know is that silver was incredibly prized in Egypt. And with a small amount of polishing, you can get the beads looking like silver. And so we wanted and needed a polishing stone with us on site as well. The final object on there are these tongs. Again, brought them with me. As you will see, they're slightly charred on the ends from picking the objects in and out of the fire. We don't know what they used. There's no evidence for any objects being used to take things in and out. We know they had tweezers and almost something that looked a bit like sugar tongs later in the dynasties, but around 3,300 BC, we've not got any evidence, either because they were made of wood, they broke, they went in the fire. It might be because of the fact they were made from copper and got turned into another object. So we've not got a clue. So these are, although they are made of authentic materials from the time period, so leather, a little bit of natural glue and wood, we don't know how accurate these are. And so forging in a field, there we have our cow parsley, our charcoal fire in a small bowl, and we had our thermocouple set up, and with the aid, I hasten to add, this is very important, with the aid of a natural wind, we were able to maintain a temperature of about 800 degrees without too much difficulty. The initial heating of the piece of meteorite took an awful lot longer than we had anticipated. So the sample that I just sent around the room is approximately 25 grams. The piece of meteorite we were using was 75 grams, so 3 times larger. But we'll have the fantastic idea of, rather than trying to heat the entire object, just focus on heating the thinnest end and being able to refine that down rather than trying to flatten the entire sheet. So here we were trying to work out how to take a flat sheet of metal and be able to bend it into a curve when all you have is a flat anvil. And as you can see here, we have one of the other hammerstones. I believe this was one of the granite rejects. We rested the sliver of meteorite. This is for the largest bead. Rested that up against the edge of it, and then using the thinnest edge of the hammerstone that's just here, we struck in at an angle, causing an initial curve in the steel. So I'll just pass this to that as well. And so you're taking your flat sheet of metal, resting it at approximately a 45-degree angle, and then punching into it. And straight away that caused an initial curve that you could then hold upright on the anvil and exploit that arc, that as you hammered down, it would start to curve. That initial phase was done holding the metal with the tongs. And then when it came to refining the curve, refining the tube shape, at that point, we actually found that we were using Professor Reren's research, and we were heating the metal to about 800 degrees. We were burying it in the ash of the fire and allowing it to cool slowly, thus annealing the metal and making it easier to be able to bend it. What's also interesting is this crack here. And this is a perfect example of that grain structure in action. If you were a modern blacksmith, you were working with wrought iron, for instance, or mild steel, and you saw a crack like that, then either the welder would come out or that would go into the scrap bin. But with meteorite, you've got a massive crack on one side, turn it over, nothing. Absolutely fine. We did, on this particular project, we did have help from the historian Dan Snow, who turns out got really infuriated by this, because part of what we were trying to do was snap when we noticed these cracks, we were then trying to exploit them by grabbing hold of the sheet of meteorite, bending it backwards and forwards to snap it off down this natural break, and nothing. You'd be there for probably, I think it was a good sort of 10 minutes in one case, and there was no sign of it breaking at all. And so you just had to keep hitting it cold until eventually the shock would go through, and you would do a process called work hardening of the metal, so it would eventually just snap off. Never where you want it to, of course, but it would eventually break into a usable sheet. Once we'd formed the beads, then it came on. Yay. It came to cleaning them up. And this is an example of the hammerstone. And what you can see there is that inside the bead, we put a twig, because if you've got, and you've got some of the beads, well, I've got the beads here at the front. If you take the beads, especially the smallest ones, and you try polishing them up on an abrasive stone, very quickly you end up with no fingerprints, because there is just nothing there to be able to hold on to. And so we found that being able to put a hard piece of wood through the center just gave us that extra bit of leverage to be able to sand these flat, be able to sand them smooth, polish them up. And also, it answers a question that was raised by both Professor Reren and Dr. Diane Johnson, which was that when they both analysed their respective beads, so Professor Reren took 3 from University College London, and Dr. Johnson took the one that's held at Manchester University, they all found copper particulates on these beads, and they hypothesized this was because they were using copper tools. This is a piece of information that we decided to discount, because if you're forging an object at around 1,000 degrees with an object that melts at around 1,000 degrees, your hammer is not necessarily going to last as long as you want it to. But it didn't answer where the particulates were coming from until we tried polishing the metal, the meteorite on this stone, and realized that the people who made the beads were copper workers. You wouldn't create this brand new industry for the creation of a small number of beads. And if they worked copper, there would be copper particles on the polishing stone they were working on. And so the copper, when they were polishing the iron beads, the copper would then transfer from the anvil onto the beads. And so in our view, that is one explanation. And so the results. Yeah, it can be done. We have proven that we have forged meteorite. The meteorite that we used at Chalk Valley History Festival was one called Gebel Kamel that landed in modern day southern Egypt around 5,000 years ago. And we made it purely, we used that meteorite purely for romantic purposes of using 5,000-year-old meteorite to make 5,000-year-old jewelry. If you remember from my red rag earlier in the presentation, it said about not being able to forge beads with an iron content greater than 3%. Gebel Kamel's nickel content is 20%. However, Gebel Kamel didn't stay in the atmosphere long enough to be able to create the Wittgenstein pattern that is synonymous with meteorites. The Wittgenstein is a very linear, chaotic pattern that is seen on an awful lot of meteorites that get polished up. And so the Gebel Kamel meteorite was far more homogeneous. It was more refined naturally than an awful lot of meteorite. However, the Campo de Cello, which was the sample that I sent around earlier on, that isn't. That is a very a perfect example of how a meteorite should be. So lots of large iron nodes, and lots of this nickel glue going inside, and has got a nickel content of, I believe, 9.8%. So much higher than the initial 3%. We found that the structure of the meteorite was instrumental in its creation. I think if that had been anything different, then we would have come across an awful lot of problems. But because of the way that it reacted when compressed with heat, then that helped us hugely. If we had just bought slivers of meteorite off the internet, because Google is a wonderful thing, and that's where we purchased the internet, purchased the meteorite from. And you can buy little necklace-sized square slivers. I don't believe it would have held up under as much force as we applied to it, and we would have struggled. But starting with a raw object and being able to work it down into these flat sheets, hot, that's the key word, hot, and then using the academic research out there to be able to bring these beads into a cylinder was perfect, absolutely marvelous with it, and would have been awful without it. Forging temperatures were very easy to reach. There was a lot of banding to and fro about how hot they would have been able to get the metal. Yes, we knew that at certain points they were forging and they were working with copper, but what we found, and actually this was Luke's help, what he told us about was the faience technology. So the very vibrant turquoise blue objects that you associate with ancient Egypt, that requires a sustained temperature of around 1,000 degrees for approximately 2 hours to be able to create one of these objects. And so being able to reach 1,000 degrees for an hour or so to make a bead was no problem whatsoever. Our toolkit held up to scrutiny. That was, we had so many rocks lying around in our site. We had backup forges. We had about 4 sets of the tons lined up just in case things burned. I can't remember how much cow parsley I harvested. I nearly got a reward letter from Dorset Council for the amount I took out of the hedgerows. But it all held up. There was the only thing we didn't do was that we didn't put a clay wad on the end of the cow parsley, the end that was nearest to the fire. And as a result, the cow parsley did start to burn. At the end, it started to sort of burn away, and so we had to keep replacing it. However, with one of these clay wads on the end to protect it, I think we'll have used 1 piece of cow parsley each the entire duration of the 7-day show. Even once it dried out, it was still strong enough to hold up. What we found, though, was that 2 people cannot keep that going for a sustained period of time. 4 people, though, could. And what we were doing as 2 people was that we would each be taking it in turns to blow into the fire. And so obviously, but with 4 people, we were able to keep that 1,000-degree temperature. We were using less air power for each person. And so we weren't working as hard as we were with 2 people. But it still needed 2 people blown into the fire simultaneously from opposite directions to be able to keep that heat going nicely. 2 people or 1 Dan Snow who's got incredible lung capacity. So if ever you've got an object that needs someone blowing through a piece of cow parsley, easy man. But everything we thought would happen happened. Everything we'd hoped and I'd dreamed about happening had happened. We ended up with 9 meteoric beads. And in the original Gerson cemetery, there were 9 beads, 7 on necklaces, and then 2 held in the hands of person in 2133, I think it was. That's okay, that's the right one. And so the conclusions. The first conclusion we came to was there needs to be a greater conversation between experimental archaeology and craftsmanship or craftspeople, because one of the institutes that we contacted, their response to what we were doing, they said, why are you doing this? And we explained, we went, yeah, but Dr. Johnson's already said these were done cold, so there's no need for you to do this. Whereas as craftspeople, and I'm slightly surprised I didn't hear more smirks from the blacksmiths in the room, we know that trying to hit something cold doesn't work. One of the granite hammers broke because we were trying to hit the Gebel Kemal meteorite cold. And so why go down that route when in actual fact, just a quick chat with a blacksmith would have, or any metalworker, they would have been able to tell you what was needed. The next conclusion we come to is there needs to be more research into these sorts of things. We've got hundreds of objects out there still. One was found a couple of months ago, an arrowhead in Bern, I think it was. I'm looking at Will because he's an arrowsmith by trade. Was it Bern? Yeah. And a meteoric arrowhead found in the Bronze Age setting. And so there is an awful lot more research to be done. But this is not a complete research package. This is just a piece of the puzzle. Hopefully this is going to start conversations, this will start thought processes. If I've put that niggling idea in the back of any of your heads to take this further, I apologize now, but thank you for the work you're going to do in the future, because it is a complete process until we find that box containing the toolkit with a small inscription saying, hello, I was a Gerson metal worker that made some meteoric beads. We're never going to know if we have done it right. We can only practice. We can only do trial and error. Other people can try doing what I've done, and they might come back saying, no, your words are not going to work with these fools. That's ridiculous. But it's a conversation. It's disproving what I've done, and that's brilliant. If you can create your part of the jigsaw puzzle, your part of this story, then that would be wonderful news. And the final conclusion is that if any of you got any questions, now is the time to ask.
Thank you so much.
You're more than
It's,
welcome.
absolutely wonderful piece of work. What I'll do is I'll open to questions from the room in a moment, and then we'll take any questions online. I wonder whether I could kick off with a question. We're talking about people working meteorites in a way that I'm completely convinced by, in an era before they're working iron otherwise. And I'm quite interested in your view as a craftsman of how they would have seen that different metal. So they were presumably making copper beads and so forth. And it's the idea that they could identify something that's fallen from the sky as something they could manipulate in the same way. We'll never know, but I'm very interested in your response to that.
As I said earlier, the only source of native iron on Earth that we're aware of is in Greenland. However, native gold and native copper is all over the place. So they would have known what a metal nugget would have looked like. And so when they found a piece of meteorite, they would have gone, it's quite heavy. It's cold to the touch, like these other metals. And so because they had an extensive metalworking history already, then they wouldn't have just, they wouldn't have assumed it was something. They wouldn't have discarded it as we know. But equally, they wouldn't have created a new technology that we're aware of. They wouldn't have created a new way of working. They wouldn't have created new toolkits specifically for these objects. I am convinced that it would have been people who knew how to make metal objects, hence the copper particles embedded in the meteorite, being from the dust, the copper dust on the anvils of the people working it. They would probably have sworn a little bit if their tools and their hammerstones in particular that were so good at working soft copper started to chip or to break with this new hard metal. And so that would have taken them by surprise initially. However, the meteorites falling would have been seen, people traverse the deserts in an awful lot, and they would know the desert as well. And so if they came across a meteorite crater, then they would have known that that wasn't there last week, and they would have investigated, they would have found the metal, and chances are that's how it got back. But the metal workers knew how to make them. The necklaces had gold beads on them. The Petrie Museum's got copper beads in there as well. And so they knew how to be able to flatten sheets, flatten metal into sheets, roll it up. And it might be why we've got a wide variety of sizes. There's 3 distinct different sizes because they were struggling to make the normal refined, beautifully refined beads they were used to. And so instead they just went for whatever the method was going to find. Will has maintained as well. He thinks that there were more of these beads created, not just the 9 that have been found. But wherever they are, we don't know. And it could be that they've all been lost to the sands of the desert, or it could be that everyone in Egypt has got a meteorite bead in their sock drawer. Who knows? But there wouldn't have been too much pomp and ceremony about it. But as I said, it could be polished to look like silver, a much revered material. And it came from the skies. So they would have known it was special, but they wouldn't have created a new industry and a new technology around the material.
That's fascinating. Thanks. Can I invite people in the room to ask you questions?
Well, I found this absolutely fascinating and I actually stayed awake, which is a great compliment to you.
The coffee is that good.
But there is one or two things I wonder about. First of all, you sort of answered this, that they would see a great crater in the ground and see a lump. So do you think that they realized the origin of this meteorite metal?
So the hieroglyph at the beginning.
I've got one or two things that relate to that.
Ah,
And I just wonder whether there are any, just as you had those fascinating pictures of people working metal.
hmm.
So I wonder if there are Egyptian reliefs which show meteorites at all, or whether in the hieroglyphic script there is
not-
an account of meteorite. And the final thing
Hmm.
that I would ask is that, do you think they could have used bamboo as the tube things to blow on the thing?
So firstly, as far as I'm aware, if I'm perfectly honest with you, I didn't look for hieroglyphic images of meteorite, but certainly when we were doing, my girlfriend will tell you how long I spent searching and researching images of Egyptian meteorite, of Egyptian metal workers. There was no mention of meteoric hieroglyphs. Meteoric images or the meteorites landing. It was all the workers themselves. And so to answer the first question, not that there's no images that I'm aware of. Sorry, what was the second question? Because I was trying to do technology. Oh, the bamboo. It would have been more, but the thing with bamboo is the way you've got the knuckles on the plant, that's actually that's sealed. And so if they were to use bamboo, they would need to make a long rod to be able to smash out those center bits. We looked at bamboo, but because the pieces we were looking at were relatively long and trying to get something down there to smash those plates out. It could easily have been done with a hardened twig or something with a copper end to it. But actually we found that the cow parsley was easier to harvest. And I think it was on the RHS website, they said that cow parsley around that time period was much more common in the Mediterranean region as well. And so we went on the understanding that it could well have grown in Egypt, especially around the Delta region. This is the tricky one.
Thank you very much. Firstly, to say thank you for a wonderful lecture. Great to be able to learn more about the objects in our collection. So thank you very much. I'm afraid I'm that person. I have a comment and a question.
Yeah.
So my comment, in fact, now I have two. There was no bamboo in Egypt, so it can't have been bamboo. But there's a possibility that if you think about the sort of rushes by the Nile, that they would have formed a kind of an example of a kind of a stiffened organic tube that might have been used, something like this. But indeed, some of them, so we can have a conversation.
I asked so my justification for that one,
Yeah.
I did ask a friend of mine who's a botanist, and she said no.
Interesting.
So,
Controversial.
I don't
Well,
think
we
she's
can,
been to Egypt though, so.
I'm not a botanist, but I do have an interest in working materials in hot conditions. So yeah, I'd love to pick that up.
Yeah.
Sort of just linked to that actually. So there's a site in northern Sudan called Amara West, where I worked for some years, and so that dates to around the late Bronze Age, so the kind of 1200 BC, and in the same space, in the same room, in the same cluster of rooms, there was very firm evidence for different hot technologies, so metal working, faience working, glass working in the same space. And we were finding things like tuyere, a kind of clay tuyere, a tube that would have been used with the bellows, I think.
Yeah.
So that's a really interesting example of that idea that you shared of this, perhaps the same tools being used in the same space for different reasons. And why would you not, if you had a stone tool that, like the one you passed around, it was so functional, why, you know, it wouldn't just be necessarily for one particular purpose. It makes sense that they would have used it in different ways. My question is, how on earth did you get into all this in the first place?
So he is responsible. So every year, the British Artists Blacksmiths Association have their annual general meeting, and that takes one of two forms. Either it's held at one of the educational colleges where we learn about new tools, new techniques, working methods, sit around drinking tea while whinging about the price of steel and coal, or it happens in a public space where we make items for a museum. So this year, for instance, it was at Butser Ancient Village. The one where I met James, it was at Ironbridge, and we were asked to create scenes about stories. And so James chose the story of the origin of blacksmithing. So we created a stylized scene of the meteorite coming down from the sky, and then a necklace of beads being created in this fire. And that was in 2013. And it sort of sat and, you know, occasionally would tap on the back of my skull, and I'd do 5 minutes of research and then realized I wasn't getting paid, and so did real work. And then in 2019, the National Heritage Ironworks Group had their annual general meeting at the Victoria Albert Museum, and they gave people a platform to talk about an iron object of their choice for 10 minutes. And so I thought, why not? You know, I've done enough research over the past 6 years that I was able to piece something together, and hoped it would get the notion of the beads out of my head. And it worked temporarily until March 2020, when COVID and lockdowns happened, and I suddenly had a lot of time and took up the research in much greater effect and with more passion. And the next year at the Chalk Valley History Festival, I spoke to James Holland, who's the director, and jokingly said, you know, can Will and I hit some meteorites next year? And I'm like, yeah, why? But because no one's done it, and as far as we are aware, no one has done this for the Gers and beads, gone out with authentic tools and equipment and worked. And so James thought it was fantastic. A side note is that the one piece of research I hadn't mentioned was the work of a chap at the Smithsonian Museum called Dr. Timothy McCoy. The reason I didn't mention his work is because he looked at some meteorite beads created by the Hopewell culture people of Havana, Illinois. And this is a wonderful piece of ethnoarchaeology, because 2,000 years after the Gers and beads were created, the Hopewell culture people also created meteoric iron beads, and I think a larger number, so 22 from memory, but their smallest bead was about the size of the largest Gerson one. And Dr. McCoy was the only person I knew of who had tried or had a go at authentically recreating one of the beads. And so I deliberately didn't read his research because I didn't want to affect my understanding of things. However, I got in touch with him after we'd finished the project to tell him what we'd done, and we compared a lot of notes and actually found that we'd worked in much the same sort of way. The only difference being he used chopsticks, which is far simpler and far easier. Well, if you like Chinese food as much as me. So, but yeah, so it was a combination of boredom, intrigue, and then as soon as I read the phrase that experimental archaeology has failed, sheer determinism, really. And sort of an urge to progress knowledge and understanding. So.
you. Thank you. Really, really interesting. Thank you very much for this. And two things. First of all, the dialogue between modern craftspeople and antiquaries to enhance that live understanding of how artifacts and objects were created, I think is something that, if you've got the time, is something that really could be taken further. My second question is, meteors are still very special for all of us. You know, holding the little meteorite is like, ooh, and it rattles, and it's a special substance, and it must have been very special for that person who, well, of that generation, the person whose grave it came from. Is there any awareness of if that was the grave itself and the person who was wearing the beads, it was a special person, a special grave, and have any others been found? Because it would be interesting to know the context of the person for whom these, or as far as one could, the person who was buried with these, if they were of a high status or not, if they had a special, or if there's anything that can be gleaned from the archaeology.
So the person that was buried with the two necklaces was, we believe, approximately 14 years old at the time of burial. What we do know is that their head was, sorry, I'm looking over here for verification. Their head was severed from the body at some point, we don't know when, and placed upright, but also the vertebrae was somehow detached. And so when that happened, we don't know. It might have been done after they were buried. It might have been the reason, understandably, the reason why they died. But what we know is that, you know, if it was done after they were buried, then why were there still gold and precious stone beads around on their persons? The grave would have been robbed. Beyond that, we're not really, don't know a huge amount about that person that I'm aware of. In the same cemetery, in grave 133, there was another person buried with two beads, one held in each hand. And so we don't know if that was maker and child, or if that was someone who just found a couple of beads and thought they looked precious and kept hold of them and stuck it in their will to be buried with them. The honest answer would be, well, certainly I'm nothing I'm aware of. And as I said, I need to reread Wainwright's initial finds report, but certainly there was no immediate mention of status of that particular person.
How different was the final bead from a silver bead? In other words, would the person who commissioned this wind up with something special or something that was not obvious in any way from a normal silver bead?
I think the biggest difference is they would have had bragging rights that their iron bead, which would have been, we think, would have been polished to a very sort of shiny finish. Their bead would have come from the sky, so it would have come from heaven or the heavens. In comparison to a silver bead, as far as I'm aware, there's not many, if any, found at that time period in that sort of geographical location. Over time, the beads would have rusted, would have tarnished. However, the very dry environment of the desert also helped to preserve the quality of the bead. So when it came out of the ground, it was approximately 90% corroded. But certainly in open air, it would have started to rust very quickly, and so it needed continual polishing. If it had been made to be worn before the person that buried with passed away. Oh, here we go. Hi, Dave.
I was just wondering, when you were actually forming these, did you use any kind of mandrel? He obviously has stick polishing. Was there any kind of mandrel used to curl them up to prevent them collapsing? And also, was there any evidence on the original beads of continued polishing? For instance, were they too corroded, or were they scanned electron microscope to show different grit polishing on the outside, show that they've been used for generation to generation and kept signing?
When they, so the mandrel question, no. Even the smallest bead that we have here, and I've got the two necklaces we created at the front, so you can come up and have a look afterwards. The smallest bead is approximately 3 millimeters in diameter. And even that one, actually, we sort of got to a point where it just started to curl in on itself. And there was, if it started to collapse, then quite honestly, that one just went to one side. And we ended up with a slightly smaller sliver. But the larger ones, we opted, initially, we were going to use a mandrel, and we had some hardened wood, or some hard wood ready to be able to use as a mandrel. But actually we found that as we were forging them, so again, it goes back to Professor Rowan's theory of annealing. Once the beads were heated, again, they were placed in the ash of the fire and to cool down slowly. Once we could hold them, then actually we were able to manipulate the bead on the anvil as we were tapping it. And so we're able to roll the bead around to be able to get a continual circle, a continual cylinder, rather than sort of trying to hold it with the grips and get sort of hammer a bit there, turn it, hammer a bit, and then it goes pinging out and pick it up again and hammer it a bit more. And so we were able to get a much smoother finish just by holding it in our fingers once it had been annealed, and then just repeated the process as much as we thought we needed until eventually it ended up as a cylinder. The second, the polishing.
Evidence of polishing.
Sorry, just remind me again. I do listen to what you say. Sorry, it's
All right.
we know each other a lot.
I just wondered if there was evidence of, for instance, scans of the electron
That was it.
microscope showed they've been polished with different grits over different times.
When the beads came out of the ground, as I said, they were approximately 90% corroded, particularly on the outside. A preservative method was applied to the beads, and now I think in Professor Rowan's paper, I believe he said comments that are about 97% corroded, and so there's not much hope of finding out how polished they were, unfortunately.
One quick question also, was there any evidence of copper on the inside of the beads?
There was no mention of it. I'm happy to refresh my memory with Professor Rowan's paper, because he, as I said, he was the one who used the point gamma activation analysis to be able to look at the center of the beads he was analyzing, and so he would be the one to be able to say whether that was whether there was copper on the inside or not. So.
Sorry.
That's right.
I just wanted to ask two things really. Have you found any sort of meaning to these beads? Because I can't imagine they're purely decorative for these people who found. And the second question I have is there, throughout your research, have you found any sort of mention of these beads in hieroglyphs, in the hieroglyphs?
There's no, beyond the fact that they were important enough for someone to be buried with them, there was no mention of them. And again, there's no mention of iron or Beatenpet beads in hieroglyphs that I'm aware of. These were, well, the beads were created. The next meteoric artifact we discovered dates approximately 700 years late, 800 years later, and around 2500 BC. And so there's no sign of continual or documented working of meteorites. I mean, the use of it was very sporadic. And if you look at the geographical locations, there's a little bit in Egypt, a bit in modern day Syria, then over to China, back to Syria, back to China, back to Egypt, over to and it's dotted around. There's no epicenter that we have discovered for meteoric working. I suppose it depends where a large enough meteorite landed for them to take note of and choose to work it. Obviously, the most well-documented use of iron is the tomb of Tutankhamun, and I can't really do a talk at the Antiquarian Society without at least acknowledging that tomb where he was buried with 19 meteoric artifacts. There was the dagger, the headrest, an amulet, and tools and equipment. It could have been that all of the pharaohs were buried with meteoric artifacts, but of course the tombs were so effectively robbed that we just will never know. I think that's the sign of the time.
Thank you again for a fascinating lecture, and your learning and the fascination has been well reflected in the questions and comments. So can we thank our speaker again for his splendid contribution this evening?
Thank you very much.
I give notice that the next meeting will be on Thursday, the 12th of October, 2023, when we'll hear a paper, The Wood That Built London, by Chris Schulte. Welcome to join us for a drink outside. Can I just say that the full events program for the Society is on our website. We're always welcome